This 63-year-old adopted 5 black children, determined to give them the love and home they deserved. For years, he sacrificed everything to give them a chance at a better life. But years later, they did something he never expected. As the family gathers, secrets unravel, and their bond is put to the ultimate test. What could these children do that would leave their father in disbelief? And when the truth comes out, will it unite them or tear them apart forever? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Thomas Blake stood before his bathroom mirror, his weathered hands carefully adjusting a navy blue tie that had seen better days. At 63, the lines on his face told stories of both joy and sorrow, each wrinkle a chapter in his life as an educator. His silver hair, neatly combed but refusing to lay completely flat, caught the morning light streaming through the small window. The modest house around him buzzed with a nervous energy. Every room held traces of his teaching career, shelves lined with dog-eared books, cardboard boxes filled with craft supplies, and forgotten toys from his classroom days. On his dresser, a folder bulged with adoption paperwork, each page representing hours of interviews, background checks, and home studies. Thomas picked up the folder with trembling fingers. "You can do this," he whispered to his reflection, straightening his shoulders. The house felt too quiet, too empty. It had been that way since losing Sarah and their son Michael 5 years ago. But today, that would change. At the adoption center, Thomas sat in a stark room that tried its best not to feel institutional. Crayon drawings decorated the white walls, their bright colors a stark contrast to the sterile environment. His heart pounded as he waited, hands clasped tightly in his lap. The door opened with a soft click, and 5 children filed in behind a social worker. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he took in each small face. Lena, the eldest at 8, stood protectively at the front, her dark eyes sizing him up with a mixture of distrust and determination. Beside her, Jordan fidgeted restlessly, his quick movements betraying his nervous energy. Tamika, 7 years old, hung back slightly, her observant gaze taking in every detail of the room and Thomas himself. Little Zora, just 6, pressed herself against Lena's side, her small hand clutching her sister's sleeve. Elijah, also 6, stood slightly apart from the others, his face partially hidden behind a well-loved stuffed lion. Thomas slowly lowered himself to one knee, making sure to meet each child's eyes with a gentle smile. "Hello," he said softly, his voice warm and steady despite his nerves. "I'm Thomas, and I'm very happy to meet all of you." The children remained silent, but Thomas noticed how Lena's stance shifted slightly, positioning herself between him and her siblings. He recognized the protective gesture for what it was: love. "I want you to know something important," Thomas continued, his voice gentle but clear. "I'm not here to replace your parents. No one could ever do that, and I wouldn't try. But I promise you this. If you choose to be part of my family, you'll never feel alone again." Later that day, Thomas watched as the children cautiously explored their new home. Jordan immediately began touching everything within reach, picking up books and examining knickknacks with curious hands. Lena followed close behind, quietly replacing items and keeping track of her siblings' whereabouts. Tamika stood in front of a bookshelf, her fingers trailing over the spines of old classics. Elijah found a quiet corner, his lion still clutched tightly to his chest, while Zora stayed close to Lena, her wide eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Thomas busied himself in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner of spaghetti and meatballs. The familiar routine of cooking helped calm his nerves as he listened to the quiet shuffling of small feet throughout the house. When they finally gathered around the dinner table, the silence felt heavy. 5 pairs of eyes watched as Thomas served each plate. The scrape of forks against plates was the only sound until, unexpectedly, Zora reached across the table and placed her small hand over Thomas's. Her smile, though tiny, carried a weight of trust that brought tears to Thomas's eyes. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Thomas stood at the stove, spatula in hand. The sizzle of pancake batter hitting the hot griddle filled the quiet house, and he hummed an old tune his mother used to sing. The familiar melody helped steady his nerves as he wondered how his new family would adjust to their first full day together. One by one, the children emerged from their rooms upstairs. Their footsteps were hesitant, like deer testing uncertain ground. The smell of butter, maple syrup, and fresh pancakes drew them toward the kitchen, but they lingered in the doorway, unsure of their place in this new morning routine. "Good morning," Thomas said cheerfully, keeping his voice gentle. "I hope everyone likes pancakes." He flipped another golden brown circle onto the growing stack, pretending not to notice their uncertainty. Lena stepped forward first, her protective instincts evident in her rigid posture. "We'll wait until you eat first," she declared, her voice firm despite its softness. The other children huddled behind her like ducklings, with Elijah clutching his stuffed lion close to his chest. After breakfast, Thomas suggested they visit the nearby park. "It's a beautiful day," he said, "and there's a lovely fountain there." The children exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them before they nodded. The park was quiet that morning, with only a few other families scattered across the green space. Jordan's eyes lit up at the sight of a massive oak tree, its branches spreading wide like welcoming arms. Before anyone could stop him, he darted toward it and began climbing with reckless abandon. "Jordan!" Thomas called out, his heart leaping into his throat as he rushed over. The boy had already scrambled halfway up the tree, his movements quick but unsteady. "Please be careful. Those branches might not be strong enough." While Thomas supervised Jordan's tree-climbing adventure, Tamika found a quiet spot near the fountain. She pulled out a small notebook and pencil from her pocket and began to sketch. Her small hand moved with surprising confidence across the paper, capturing the play of water and light with remarkable skill. Thomas noticed her concentration and slowly approached, not wanting to startle her. "May I see what you're drawing?" he asked softly. Tamika hesitated before turning the notebook slightly toward him. The sketch showed the fountain in beautiful detail, each water droplet seemingly caught in motion. "This is wonderful, Tamika. You have a real gift." A tiny smile flickered across her face like sunshine breaking through clouds, and she ducked her head shyly at the praise. That evening, Thomas gathered the children in the living room for bedtime stories. He settled into the old armchair, a well-loved copy of Where the Wild Things Are in his hands. Elijah sat closest to him on the floor, his lion held tight against his chest, but his eyes were fixed on the colorful pages as Thomas read. When the story ended, Zora's small voice broke the quiet. Could you read another one?" she asked, her words barely above a whisper. Thomas smiled warmly, already reaching for the next book. "Of course, sweetheart." From her position in the doorway, Lena watched the scene unfold. Her arms remained crossed over her chest, but some of the tension had left her shoulders. As she observed her siblings' rapt attention to Thomas's storytelling, saw Tamika's small smile and Zora's growing comfort, something in her fierce expression softened just a fraction. The following week, Thomas Blake sat in the principal's office of Cedar Grove Elementary, surrounded by stacks of enrollment forms. The morning light streamed through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the wooden desk. His 5 children sat in chairs along the wall, their feet barely touching the floor. "Mr. Blake," Principal Martinez said, adjusting her glasses, "we'll need to discuss proper class placement for each child." She shuffled through the papers, her brow furrowing. "According to their previous records—" "I need to be with Jordan," Lena interrupted, her voice firm. "We've always been in the same class." The principal glanced up, surprised. "Well, we typically separate twins to encourage independent development." "But who will watch him?" Lena's fingers gripped the edges of her chair. "He gets into trouble sometimes." Thomas reached over and patted her hand gently. "Lena, sweetheart, the teachers will make sure everyone's okay. Jordan can manage on his own." The words had barely left his mouth when 3 days later the principal's secretary called. Jordan had gotten into a fight during recess. Thomas rushed to the school, his heart heavy with worry. He found Jordan sitting outside the principal's office, knuckles scraped and uniform shirt wrinkled. "He was making fun of Elijah's lion," Jordan mumbled before Thomas could ask. "Called him a baby. I couldn't let him do that." Thomas knelt beside Jordan's chair. "I understand wanting to protect your brother," he said softly. But fighting isn't the answer. We need to find better ways to handle these situations. Principal Martinez called them in and they discussed the incident. The other boy had a bloody nose, but nothing serious. Still, rules were rules, and Jordan received detention. That evening, as Thomas prepared dinner, Tamika approached him shyly, holding a piece of paper behind her back. "I made something in art class today," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "May I see it?" Thomas asked, wiping his hands on a dish towel. Tamika slowly revealed her painting. 6 figures stood hand in hand in front of a house, 5 small ones and 1 tall one. The details were remarkable for a 7-year-old. Elijah's lion clutched in one hand, Zora's favorite purple dress, Jordan's untied shoelaces, Lena's determined stance, and Thomas's kind smile. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "This is beautiful, Tamika," he managed to say. He carefully attached it to the refrigerator with alphabet magnets. "Right here, where everyone can see it." During dinner, Jordan recounted the fight, acting out the scenes with his fork. "And then he went whoosh, and I went pow," he demonstrated, accidentally flinging a piece of broccoli across the table. The vegetable landed squarely on Zora's nose, and for a moment everyone froze. Then Zora giggled, a sound they hadn't heard before, and soon the whole table erupted in laughter. Even Lena couldn't maintain her serious expression. Thomas looked around at his children's faces, bright with mirth. Jordan was dramatically reenacting the flying broccoli incident. Tamika was quietly giggling behind her hand, and Elijah had temporarily set his lion aside to protect it from stray vegetables. The sound of their combined laughter filled the kitchen, bouncing off the walls and warming the space in a way that mere heating never could. Tamika's family portrait watched over them from the refrigerator, its crayon-bright colors a testament to their growing bonds. In just a week, they had begun to feel less like separate pieces and more like a family finding its rhythm. Rain drummed steadily against the windows of the Blake household that Saturday morning. Thomas stood in the living room, unpacking cardboard boxes he'd retrieved from the garage. Years of teaching had left him with a treasure trove of art supplies: watercolors, colored pencils, sketch pads, and construction paper in every shade imaginable. "Tamika," he called softly, noticing her hovering in the doorway. "I thought you might like a special place to create your art." He'd cleared a corner of the living room, setting up a small wooden desk beneath the bay window. Natural light filtered through the rain-streaked glass, creating the perfect atmosphere for an artist. Tamika approached cautiously, her eyes widening at the sight of the pristine art supplies laid out before her. These are all for me?" she whispered, running her fingers along the edge of a new sketchbook. "All yours," Thomas smiled. "Every artist needs proper tools." From the corner of his eye, he noticed Zora peeking around the doorframe, drawn by her sister's obvious excitement. She inched closer, watching as Tamika picked up a set of watercolors with reverent hands. "Thank you," Tamika said, her voice barely audible above the rain. She settled into the chair, immediately opening the sketchbook to its first clean page. Zora crept closer, fascinated by her sister's growing confidence. Thomas noticed how she watched Tamika's every move, particularly when her sister began mixing colors on a palette. "Would you like to join her, Zora?" Thomas asked gently. Before she could answer, a clattering sound from the kitchen caught Thomas's attention. He found Jordan sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by pieces of an old radio he'd discovered. "It's broken," Jordan explained quickly, as if afraid he'd be in trouble. "I thought maybe—" "You know," Thomas said, kneeling beside him. "I have a workshop in the garage where we could fix this properly. Would you like to see it?" Jordan's face lit up. "Really? You're not mad?" "Mad? Not at all. Come on, I'll show you how to use my tools." In the workshop, Thomas demonstrated how to use a screwdriver properly, guiding Jordan's smaller hands. The boy proved to be a quick learner, his natural curiosity shining through as they worked together. "My dad used to fix things too," Jordan said suddenly, testing a loose wire. "Before—" Thomas nodded, understanding. "Tell me about him. What kind of things did he fix?" As they worked, Jordan opened up, sharing stories about his father, They laughed together when Jordan told jokes, some good, some terrible, but Thomas cherished each one as a sign of growing trust. Later that night, thunder crashed overhead, shaking the house. Thomas was reading in his study when he heard a small whimper from upstairs. Following the sound, he found Elijah's bed empty. A quick search revealed the boy huddled beneath it, clutching his stuffed lion tightly. "Mind if I join you down there?" Thomas asked, lying on his stomach to peer under the bed. Elijah shook his head, making room for Thomas to slide partially under the bed frame. "You know," Thomas began, "this reminds me of a story about a brave explorer who discovered a magical cave during a thunderstorm." Elijah's grip on his lion loosened slightly. "What happened to him?" Thomas launched into a tale of adventure, making up details as he went along. With each crack of thunder, he wove the sound into the story, transforming it from something frightening into something magical. Gradually, Elijah's tense shoulders relaxed and his eyes grew heavy. "Can we finish the story up there?" Thomas suggested gently, pointing to the bed. Elijah nodded, crawling out from his hiding place. Thomas helped him back into bed, continuing the story in softer tones as he rubbed small circles on the boy's back. Before long, Elijah drifted off to sleep, his lion tucked securely under his chin. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows as Thomas prepared breakfast for the family. The smell of bacon and eggs filled the air while the children settled around the table. The usual morning chatter was interrupted by a knock at the door. "Mail's here," called the carrier through the screen door, holding up a stack of envelopes. Thomas retrieved the mail, sorting through bills and advertisements until he came across an envelope addressed to Lena in neat handwriting. "This one's for you, Lena." Lena's eyes widened as she took the letter, her hand trembling slightly. Without a word, she pushed away from the table and hurried upstairs, leaving her breakfast untouched. "Is Lena okay?" Zora asked, her voice small with worry. "I'm sure she's fine," Thomas reassured her, though concern creased his forehead. Over the next few days, a change came over Lena. She spoke less at meals and spent more time alone in her room. Her siblings noticed the difference. Tamika's attempts to share her latest artwork were met with distracted nods, and even Jordan's usual antics failed to draw her usual stern reactions. One evening, Thomas found Lena sitting on the back porch steps, staring at the setting sun. He settled beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "carrying a heavy thought alone makes it weigh twice as much." Lena pulled the now creased letter from her pocket. "It's from my mother's cousin," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "She says she just found out about us and wants to reconnect." Thomas waited patiently as Lena gathered her thoughts. "I should be happy, right?" She turned to look at him, her eyes glistening. "But every time I think about responding, I feel guilty. Like I'm betraying my parents by being happy here, with you and everyone else." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I had a brother once, James. We were close as kids, but after our parents died, we had different ideas about handling their estate. Words were said, pride got in the way, and before we knew it, years had passed without speaking." Lena listened intently as Thomas continued. "I learned something important from that experience. Family isn't about replacing people in your heart. It's about making room for more love." "But what if—" Lena's voice cracked. "What if letting myself love this family means I'm forgetting them?" "Love doesn't work that way," Thomas said gently. "Your heart isn't like a glass that can only hold so much. It's more like a garden. There's always room to grow more flowers." Tears rolled down Lena's cheeks as she pulled out a worn family photo from her pocket. "Mom used to say something similar. She always told us that love multiplies, it doesn't divide." "Your mother sounds like a very wise woman," Thomas smiled softly. "She was," Lena agreed, wiping her eyes. "And I think she'd want me to be happy, to let myself have this new family while keeping her memory in my heart." Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to figure everything out right now. Just know that whatever you decide about your mother's cousin, your place in this family is secure. We're here for you, Lena, however you need us to be." For the first time in days, Lena's smile reached her eyes. From inside the house came the sound of Jordan and Elijah arguing over a video game, followed by Tamika's voice trying to mediate. Zora's giggle floated through the screen door. "I think," Lena said slowly, "I'd like to give this family thing a real try. All of it. The good parts and the messy parts." The school gymnasium buzzed with excitement as Mrs. Peterson, the music teacher, announced the upcoming talent show. "We want everyone to share their special gifts," she said, her voice carrying across the assembly. In the crowd of students, Jordan's eyes lit up while Tamika clutched her sketchbook closer to her chest. That evening at home, Thomas noticed the talent show flyer sticking out of Jordan's backpack. "Something catch your interest today?" he asked, setting down plates for dinner. "I've been learning some card tricks," Jordan admitted, pulling a deck from his pocket. "Maybe I could do magic in the show." Thomas's face brightened. "That's a wonderful idea. Why don't you show us what you've got so far?" Jordan's first attempt at making a card disappear ended with cards scattered across the kitchen floor, causing Zora to giggle and even Lena to crack a smile. "We'll work on that," Thomas said, helping him gather the cards. Tamika hesitated before speaking up. "I was thinking, maybe I could display some of my paintings?" "Your art deserves to be seen," Thomas encouraged. "What do you think about creating something special for the show?" Over the next few weeks, the Blake house transformed into a practice stage. Thomas cleared space in the living room where Jordan could rehearse his tricks. Tamika set up an easel by the window, working on a series of paintings that told the story of their family. Surprisingly, Zora asked to help, showing an unexpected talent for arranging the artwork into a compelling display. Even Elijah, usually content to observe from the sidelines, found himself drawn into the preparations. He helped Jordan organize his props and suggested ways to make the magic tricks more dramatic. "What if you used my lion in the act?" he offered one afternoon, holding out his beloved stuffed animal. Jordan's eyes widened at this unprecedented offer. "You'd let me borrow him?" "Just don't make him disappear for real," Elijah said with a small smile. The house rang with laughter during rehearsals. When Jordan accidentally launched a playing card into Thomas's coffee cup, they all dissolved into fits of giggles. When Tamika spilled paint on her shirt, Lena surprised everyone by turning it into an impromptu art piece, adding more colorful splatters and a pattern. Thomas watched it all with joy, noticing how the talent show preparations were bringing out new sides of his children. Lena, though not performing herself, took on the role of stage manager, helping everyone organize their acts and offering encouragement in her own practical way. On the night of the talent show, the school auditorium filled with parents and students. Thomas sat in the third row, camera ready. Jordan's magic act came first. Despite a slight fumble with one card trick, his natural charm and showmanship had the audience cheering, especially when he produced Elijah's lion from an apparently empty box. When Tamika's art display was unveiled, a hush fell over the crowd. She had created a series of paintings showing scenes from their daily life: breakfast around the kitchen table, afternoons in the park, evenings reading together. The final piece showed all 6 of them, including Thomas, painted with such love and detail that it brought tears to many eyes. The standing ovation that followed made Tamika blush with pride, while Zora beamed beside her, proud of their joint presentation. Thomas could hardly contain his emotions as he watched from his seat, tears streaming down his face. Each child had shown such courage, such growth. The audience's warm response reflected what he had known all along. These children were extraordinary. A year had passed since the talent show, and the Blake household bustled with back-to-school energy. Thomas noticed subtle changes in each of his children as they prepared for the new term. Lena organized everyone's supplies with her usual efficiency, while Jordan complained about having to wake up early again. Tamika carefully arranged her new art supplies, and Elijah packed his science books with quiet enthusiasm. But something was different about Zora. She sat at the breakfast table, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate without taking a single bite. Her shoulders hunched forward as if carrying an invisible weight. Thomas watched her with growing concern, remembering how she used to at least nibble at her toast. "Did everyone remember their permission slips?" Thomas asked, trying to maintain normalcy. The other children nodded or mumbled responses, but Zora remained silent, her eyes fixed on her untouched breakfast. After the others had filed out to catch the bus, Thomas gently touched Zora's shoulder. "Why don't we have a little chat before you head to school?" Zora nodded almost imperceptibly, following him to the living room. They sat on the worn leather couch where they'd shared so many bedtime stories. Thomas noticed how she wrung her hands in her lap, a nervous habit he'd seen more frequently lately. "Something's bothering you, isn't it?" Thomas kept his voice soft and patient. "You can tell me anything, you know that." Tears welled up in Zora's eyes. When she spoke, her stutter was more pronounced than usual. They laugh at me in C class." "Who laughs at you, sweetheart?" "The girls in my class. They make fun of how I talk." Zora's voice trembled. "They say I'm too quiet and weird." Thomas felt his heart ache. He reached for her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You know, when I was your age, I struggled with confidence too. I was the shortest boy in my class, and other kids teased me about it." Zora looked up, surprise momentarily replacing her distress. Really? But you're so brave now." "It took time," Thomas explained, "and I had people who helped me believe in myself. Just like I believe in you." He shared stories from his own childhood about feeling different and learning to embrace his uniqueness. As he spoke, Zora's rigid posture gradually relaxed. That afternoon, Thomas met with Mrs. Harrison, Zora's teacher. The experienced educator listened intently as Thomas explained the situation. "I've noticed Zora withdrawing during group activities," Mrs. Harrison admitted. "I think I know which students you're referring to." Together, they developed a plan. Mrs. Harrison would rearrange the seating chart to place Zora near kinder classmates. They would also incorporate more partner activities, giving Zora chances to interact in smaller, less intimidating groups. "There's also a wonderful speech therapist who comes to our school twice a week," Mrs. Harrison suggested. "She's helped many students build confidence in their communication skills." Thomas nodded enthusiastically. "That sounds perfect. And at home, we'll work on building her confidence too." When Thomas shared these plans with Zora that evening, he saw something change in her expression. Though still hesitant, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. She hugged him tightly, whispering, Thank you, Dad." It was the first time she had called him Dad, and Thomas had to blink back tears as he hugged her back. While Thomas focused on helping Zora, changes were taking place in Jordan's life. The 14-year-old had started hanging around with Marcus Thompson, a 16-year-old from the local high school. Marcus wore expensive sneakers and always seemed to have the latest gadgets, which immediately caught Jordan's attention. "Man, how do you get all this stuff?" Jordan asked one day, admiring Marcus's new smartphone. Marcus just smirked, slinging an arm around Jordan's shoulders. "Let's just say I know how to get what I want. Stick with me, and I'll show you how." Over the next few weeks, Jordan started coming home later and later. Thomas noticed the pattern, along with other concerning changes. New headphones appeared in Jordan's room, then a sleek gaming controller, and finally a smartwatch that Thomas knew they couldn't afford on his teacher's pension. "Where did you get that watch, Jordan?" Thomas asked one evening. Jordan shrugged, pulling his sleeve over it. "Found it. Someone must have lost it at school." Thomas didn't believe him, but before he could press further, Jordan had disappeared into his room. One sunny afternoon, Jordan approached Elijah, who was reading a marine biology book on the front porch. "Hey, want to hit the arcade with me and my friend Marcus?" Elijah hesitated. He rarely went out, preferring the company of his books, but something in Jordan's eager expression made him agree. At the arcade, Marcus greeted them with his usual confident smile. After a few games, Marcus led them to a convenience store nearby. "Watch and learn," he whispered, casually pocketing a candy bar while pretending to browse magazines. Jordan followed suit, grabbing a handful of chocolate bars. He nudged Elijah, who stood frozen by the display. "Come on, it's easy. Nobody's watching." Elijah's hands trembled as he reached for a candy bar. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure the store owner could hear it. Just as he slipped it into his pocket, the owner looked up. The boys hurried out, trying to act natural. Once they were several blocks away, Marcus laughed and distributed their stolen goods. But Elijah felt sick to his stomach. The candy bar in his pocket seemed to burn through his clothes. That evening, while Thomas was grading papers in his study, Elijah appeared in the doorway. His face was pale, and he clutched something in his hand. "Dad," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "I did something bad." Tears streamed down his face as he placed the stolen candy bar on Thomas's desk. As Elijah recounted the afternoon's events, Thomas's expression grew increasingly troubled. When Jordan came home later, Thomas was waiting in the living room. "Jordan, we need to talk about Marcus," Thomas said firmly, "and about stealing." Jordan's face darkened. "You don't know anything about Marcus. He's the only one who gets me." "He's getting you into trouble, son. Stealing isn't the way." "Don't call me son," Jordan shouted, his voice cracking. "You're not my real father. You can't tell me what to do." Before Thomas could respond, Jordan yanked open the front door and ran into the gathering darkness. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching his son disappear down the street, his heart heavy with worry and determination. The next morning, Thomas Blake paced anxiously in the police station, his weathered hands clutching a recent photo of Jordan. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his worried face as he filed a missing persons report. Back home, the atmosphere was thick with tension and fear. "You should have seen this coming," Lena said, her voice sharp with accusation. "Marcus was obviously trouble. Why didn't you do something sooner?" Thomas ran his fingers through his gray hair. "You're right, Lena. I should have been more vigilant." In the corner of the living room, Elijah sat hunched over, his stuffed lion pressed tightly against his chest. Tamika and Zora flanked him on either side, trying their best to offer comfort. "It's all my fault," Elijah whispered, tears rolling down his cheeks. "If I hadn't told about the candy—" Tamika wrapped an arm around his shoulders. "No, Elijah. You did the right thing. Jordan made his own choices." After hours of waiting with no word from the police, Thomas couldn't sit still any longer. He grabbed his car keys and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Lena demanded. "To find your brother," Thomas replied firmly. "I won't just wait here while he's out there somewhere." Thomas started at the arcade, where the manager remembered Jordan but hadn't seen him since yesterday. At the park, a group of teenagers pointed him toward the convenience store where the shoplifting had occurred. The shopkeeper, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Chen, recognized Thomas's description of Marcus. "Those boys," she said, shaking her head. "I see them sometimes hanging out under the old railway bridge near Wilson Street. Be careful, though. It's not a nice area." Thomas thanked her and drove to the location. His heart pounded as he parked his car and walked toward the bridge. The afternoon sun cast long shadows under the concrete structure, where he could make out a group of teenagers lounging on old furniture they'd dragged there. Jordan sat on a torn couch beside Marcus, his shoulders slumped. When he spotted Thomas approaching, he jumped to his feet. "Jordan!" Thomas called out softly, keeping his distance. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Marcus stood up, positioning himself between them. "He doesn't want to talk to you, old man. Just leave him alone." But Thomas kept his eyes fixed on Jordan. "Son, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. I made mistakes too, but there's a family at home that loves you and misses you terribly." Jordan's tough exterior cracked slightly. "I messed up," he mumbled. "We all mess up sometimes," Thomas said gently. "But that doesn't change how much I care about you. Remember when we fixed that old radio together? That's the real you, Jordan. Someone who creates, not destroys. Someone who helps, not hurts." Tears welled up in Jordan's eyes. "But after what I did—" "There's always a way back home," Thomas assured him. "Always. No matter what." Marcus scoffed. "Don't tell me you're buying this sappy stuff?" But Jordan was already stepping around Marcus, moving toward Thomas. "I want to go home," he said quietly. Thomas opened his arms and Jordan walked into them, burying his face in his adoptive father's shoulder. As they headed back to the car, leaving Marcus and his influence behind, Jordan wiped his eyes. "Dad, he said hesitantly. I'm sorry. Thomas squeezed his shoulder. I know, son. I know. When Jordan stepped through the front door with Thomas, his siblings rushed forward. Elijah hung back slightly, uncertainty written across his young face. Jordan knelt down to his little brother's level, his eyes filled with remorse. I'm so sorry, Elijah, Jordan said, his voice cracking. I never should have gotten you mixed up in all that. You were braver than me. You told the truth. Elijah clutched his stuffed lion tighter but took a small step forward. I was scared you wouldn't come back. Jordan opened his arms and Elijah fell into them. Soon, the other siblings joined the embrace, creating a tight circle of forgiveness and love. Thomas watched from the doorway, his heart full at the sight of his children coming together. Later that evening, Thomas gathered everyone in the living room. He had pushed the coffee table aside and laid out cushions in a circle on the floor. The warm glow of table lamps created a cozy atmosphere as the family settled down. I think it's time we all talked, Thomas said gently. Really talked. About the things that worry us, the things that make us scared or sad. Lena, who had been quiet since Jordan's return, spoke first. I'm tired, she admitted, her usual strong facade crumbling slightly. I try so hard to watch out for everyone to make sure nothing bad happens, but sometimes it feels like too much. Thomas reached over and squeezed her hand. You don't have to carry that burden alone anymore, Lena. That's what I'm here for. Tamika pulled her sketchbook closer to her chest. Sometimes I think my art isn't good enough, she said softly. The other kids at school draw better than me. Your art is beautiful because it comes from your heart, Thomas assured her. It's not about being better than anyone else. Zora, sitting cross-legged between Tamika and Elijah, twisted her hands in her lap. The bullying is getting better, she shared. My speech therapy is helping, and Ms. Roberts lets me give my presentations just to her after class. A small smile crossed her face. Last week, I even answered a question in front of everyone. The family murmured words of encouragement, making Zora's smile grow wider. Elijah hugged his lion close. I want to be brave, he said. Not just pretend brave with my lion, but really brave. Like when Jordan needed help, I should have told sooner. But you did tell, Thomas reminded him. That was real bravery. Jordan, who had been listening intently, added, Yeah, you were the bravest of all of us, little brother. Thomas cleared his throat. I have an idea, he announced. What if we had a special family night every week? A time just for us to be together, play games, talk about our days, whatever we want. The children's faces lit up at the suggestion. Thomas stood up and retrieved a stack of board games from the hallway closet. Why wait, he said, spreading the games out on the floor. Let's start tonight. They chose a colorful board game, and soon the living room filled with the sounds of dice rolling, playful arguments over rules, and genuine laughter. Lena relaxed her watchful stance, allowing herself to enjoy the moment. Tamika sketched funny caricatures of everyone's reactions to winning and losing. Zora cheered without hesitation when she moved ahead on the board. Elijah, caught up in the fun, set his lion aside to roll the dice with both hands. Jordan's competitive spirit showed itself in a healthy way as he good-naturedly challenged his siblings. As Thomas watched his children play, he saw the invisible wounds of the past few days beginning to heal. They were learning that family meant having a safe place to fall. The years passed swiftly in the Blake household, and the children blossomed into teenagers, each finding their own path. Thomas watched with pride as their individual talents and dreams took shape, though his heart ached a little at how quickly they were growing up. Tamika, now 15, sat cross-legged on her bed, staring at the acceptance letter from the prestigious Summer Arts Institute. Her fingers traced the embossed letterhead as she read the words for the 10th time. The program was everything she'd ever dreamed of. 3 months of intensive art training with renowned instructors, gallery exhibitions, and connections that could shape her future. But the tuition costs made her stomach twist into knots. Down the hall, Lena pored over college brochures spread across her desk. Yale, Harvard, Stanford, the names seemed to glow on the glossy pages. Her grades were impeccable, her extracurricular activities impressive, But the thought of leaving her siblings behind made her chest tighten. She'd been their protector for so long. How could she step away? The distant sound of electric guitar drifted up from the basement, where Jordan had set up his makeshift music studio. His band, the Midnight Mechanics, practiced 3 times a week. The name was a nod to his dual passions, music and fixing things. Thomas had helped him soundproof the space, transforming the basement into a sanctuary where Jordan could channel his energy into creating rather than destroying. That evening, Thomas prepared a family favorite, his homemade lasagna. As the rich aroma filled the kitchen, he noticed the unusual quiet at the dinner table. Tamika kept folding and unfolding her napkin, while Lena seemed lost in thought, barely touching her food. "I see a lot of wheels turning tonight," Thomas said gently, looking around at his children. "Anyone want to share what's on their mind?" Tamika glanced at her siblings, then back at her plate. I got accepted to the Summer Arts Institute," she said quietly. "Tamika, that's wonderful." Thomas's face lit up with genuine joy. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "It's really expensive," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know we can't afford." "Now hold on," Thomas interrupted kindly. "Let's not decide what we can and can't do before we've even looked at the possibilities. I've been saving for each of your futures since the day you arrived. We'll figure this out together." Encouraged by Tamika's revelation, Lena spoke up. "I've been thinking about college applications," she said. "The Ivy Leagues." "Of course you have," Thomas beamed. "You've worked incredibly hard, Lena. Those schools would be lucky to have you." "But what about everyone here?" Lena's voice wavered slightly. "I can't just leave?" "You're not leaving us," Jordan interjected, surprising everyone with his insight. "You're just spreading your wings a bit wider. Besides, someone's got to be our family's first Ivy League graduate." Thomas nodded approvingly at Jordan's words. "Your siblings will be fine, Lena, and you'll always have a home here to come back to." The tension around the table began to dissolve. Tamika's shoulders relaxed as she pulled out the program brochure to share with everyone. Jordan launched into an animated description of his band's upcoming performance at the school talent show. Lena allowed herself to smile as she discussed potential college majors. Thomas watched his children share their dreams, his heart swelling with pride. They had come so far from those first uncertain days, growing not just as individuals, but as a family that supported each other's aspirations. The summer sun beat down on the bus station as the Blake family gathered to bid farewell to Tamika. Her large art portfolio case leaned against her legs while she clutched the straps of her backpack nervously. The reality of leaving home for 3 months was finally sinking in. Thomas approached her with a wrapped package in his hands. "I got you something for the journey," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Tamika carefully unwrapped it to reveal a leather-bound sketchbook, its pages thick and pristine. On the inside cover, Thomas had written, "To capture all your new adventures. Love, Dad." Tamika's eyes welled up as she traced the word Dad. It was the first time she'd seen him refer to himself that way in writing, though they'd all been calling him that for years now. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, holding him tight. Jordan stepped forward next, attempting to lighten the mood. "Don't forget about us little people when you're a famous artist," he teased, but his hug was fierce and protective. Zora, usually quiet, surprised everyone by presenting Tamika with a small friendship bracelet she'd made. "So you won't feel alone," she explained softly. Elijah added his own goodbye, pressing his old stuffed lion into her hands. "He'll keep you safe," he insisted, though he was far too old for stuffed animals now. Lena was the last to say goodbye, holding her sister close. "Call me every day," she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Even if it's just to say hello." As Tamika boarded the bus, Thomas watched his daughter take her first steps toward independence, his heart swelling with both pride and worry. Weeks later, as Tamika thrived in her art program, Lena sat at the kitchen table surrounded by college acceptance letters. The prestigious names seemed to blur together: Yale, Princeton, Columbia, Stanford. Each offered different opportunities, different paths forward. I don't know how to choose, Lena admitted to Thomas one evening. They're all amazing schools. Thomas pulled up a chair beside her. Let's break it down, he suggested, pulling out a notebook. Together, they created lists of pros and cons for each university, discussing everything from academic programs to distance from home. Columbia has an excellent law program, Lena mused, and it's only a few hours away. I could come home on weekends sometimes. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. You shouldn't choose based solely on distance, he advised, but being able to visit more often would be wonderful. After careful consideration, Lena made her decision. Columbia felt right, prestigious enough to challenge her academically while keeping her connected to her family. As August approached, the house became a flurry of activity. Boxes and suitcases filled Lena's room as the family helped her pack. Each item sparked a memory: the debate trophy from sophomore year, the family photo from their first Christmas together, the worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that Thomas had given her when she first expressed interest in law. Jordan and Elijah carried boxes down to the car while Zora helped organize Lena's clothes. Thomas stood in the doorway of her room, watching his eldest daughter prepare for this momentous change. When Lena looked up and caught his eye, she saw tears threatening to spill. "Dad," she began, but Thomas shook his head, pulling her into a tight embrace. "I am so incredibly proud of you," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "This house will always be your home, no matter where life takes you. Remember that." Thomas Blake sat in his favorite armchair, reviewing some household bills when the phone rang. He reached for it absently, expecting another update from Lena about her college experiences. Instead, a formal voice introduced herself as the director of Tamika's art program. "Mr. Blake, I'm calling because we're concerned about Tamika," the director said, her tone professional but worried. "She hasn't attended any classes for the past 3 weeks." Thomas's hand tightened on the receiver. "There must be some mistake," he said, his throat suddenly dry. "Tamika calls us every few days. She's been telling us about her projects." "I'm afraid not, Mr. Blake. We've tried reaching out to her multiple times, but she hasn't responded to any of our messages." After hanging up, Thomas immediately dialed Tamika's number. The phone rang endlessly before going to voicemail. His text messages went unanswered. With each passing minute, his concern grew deeper, forming a heavy knot in his stomach. Meanwhile, upstairs, Zora was searching through Jordan's messy room for a book she'd lent him. As she moved aside a pile of clothes near his bed, her hand knocked against something that clinked. Pushing the clothes further aside, she discovered what was making the sound: a collection of empty liquor bottles hidden beneath Jordan's bed. Zora's heart sank as she counted them. 12 bottles in total, some expensive brands she knew Jordan couldn't afford on his part-time job salary. She sat on the edge of his bed, the discovery weighing heavily on her mind. Should she tell Thomas? Confront Jordan directly? The responsibility of this knowledge felt overwhelming. During dinner that evening, the tension was palpable. Thomas picked at his food, his mind clearly elsewhere as he worried about Tamika. Jordan slouched in his chair, barely touching his meal, while Zora kept shooting concerned glances at her brother. After dinner, Zora followed Jordan up to his room. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. Jordan flopped onto his bed, raising an eyebrow. "About what?" "I found the bottles, Jordan." Zora's voice was quiet but firm. "Hidden under your bed." Jordan's face darkened immediately. "You were snooping through my stuff?" he demanded, sitting up straight. "I was looking for my book," Zora defended herself. "But that's not the point. How long has this been going on?" "Nothing's going on," Jordan snapped, standing up. "I had some friends over. We had a few drinks. It's not a big deal." 12 bottles isn't a few drinks," Zora countered, her voice rising. "And some of those bottles, there's no way you could afford them. Where did they come from?" "Get out of my room!" Jordan shouted, his face flushed with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about!" Their raised voices carried downstairs where Thomas had been trying to reach Tamika again. He hurried up the stairs, following the sound of the argument. As he approached Jordan's room, he could hear the accusations flying back and forth. "You need help, Jordan. I need you to mind your own business." Thomas pushed open the door to find his children red-faced and angry, standing on opposite sides of the room. The sight of them fighting, combined with Tamika's concerning situation, made his heart ache. Something was very wrong with his family, and he hadn't seen it coming. "What's going on here?" he asked quietly, his calm voice cutting through their argument like a knife. Both Jordan and Zora fell silent, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. Thomas looked between his children, seeing the pain and worry in Zora's eyes and the defensive anger in Jordan's posture. The family he had worked so hard to build was starting to crack at the seams. Thomas Blake packed a small overnight bag, his movements deliberate despite the worry gnawing at his insides. As he headed for the door, Jordan appeared with his own backpack. "I'm coming with you," Jordan said, his voice leaving no room for argument. His eyes, usually defiant, held a mix of concern and something else, perhaps guilt over his own recent behavior. Thomas nodded, understanding that Jordan needed this as much as he did. "Zora," he called out, "you'll be okay looking after the house?" Zora emerged from the kitchen, arms crossed. "Just find her and bring her home," she said softly. The 3-hour drive to the city was mostly silent. Thomas gripped the steering wheel tightly while Jordan stared out the window, his fingers drumming nervously on his knee. They started their search at the Art Institute, where a sympathetic administrator shared that Tamika had cleared out her studio space weeks ago. "She was so talented," the administrator said, shaking her head. But after the midterm critique, something changed. They spent hours checking local cafes and art supply stores, showing Tamika's photo to anyone who might have seen her. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings as they ventured into increasingly unfamiliar neighborhoods. A barista at a small coffee shop finally gave them a lead. "Yeah, I've seen her. She comes in sometimes before her shift at the Gateway Diner." The Gateway Diner sat in a rundown area, its neon sign flickering weakly in the early evening light. Through the grimy windows, Thomas spotted Tamika carrying plates to a table. She looked thinner, her usual graceful movements replaced by exhausted shuffling. "Oh, sweetheart," Thomas whispered, his heart breaking at the sight. Jordan's face tightened. "This is where she's been? Instead of coming home?" They entered the diner, the bell above the door announcing their arrival. Tamika turned, plate still in hand, and froze. The color drained from her face as the dishes slipped from her grasp, shattering on the floor. "Dad? Jordan?" Her voice trembled. "What are you doing here?" Thomas stepped forward, carefully avoiding the broken plates. "We've been worried sick about you, honey. Why didn't you tell us?" Tears welled up in Tamika's eyes as her carefully constructed facade crumbled. "I couldn't," she choked out. "The teachers said my work was derivative, uninspired. They said I was wasting my potential." She wrapped her arms around herself. "I couldn't face everyone after failing. I couldn't disappoint you like that." Jordan moved closer, his earlier anger forgotten. "So you thought disappearing was better? Living in some dump and working at a diner?" "Jordan," Thomas warned, but Tamika shook her head. "He's right," she said, wiping her eyes. "I was scared. I am scared. Everything I thought I was good at. Maybe I was just fooling myself." Thomas reached out and took her trembling hands in his. "You haven't failed anyone, Tamika, but you don't have to face this alone. Come home with us." Back at home, Tamika retreated to her room like a wounded animal, the door closing with a soft click that felt somehow louder than a slam. Her easel stood in the corner, covered with a sheet, like a ghost of what she used to be. Thomas Blake would knock gently each day, bringing her meals and quiet encouragement, but her responses grew shorter and more distant. "I can't paint anymore," she would say, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "There's nothing left in me." Meanwhile, Jordan's behavior became increasingly erratic. Empty bottles clinked in his backpack when he came home late, his eyes glazed and movements unsteady. The sweet smell of alcohol followed him like a shadow, and his temper flared at the smallest provocations. One particularly dark night, Jordan stumbled through the front door well past midnight. He crashed into the hallway table, sending a photo frame clattering to the floor. Elijah, who had been studying in the living room, rushed to help. "You need to be quieter," Elijah whispered, reaching for Jordan's arm. "Everyone's sleeping." Jordan yanked his arm away, his face twisting with sudden anger. "Oh, look who it is. The perfect son. Always doing the right thing, aren't you, Elijah?" "Jordan, please." "No!" Jordan's voice rose sharply. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You with your fancy science books and your perfect grades. You make me sick." The commotion brought Thomas running downstairs, with Tamika and Zora appearing in their doorways. Jordan swayed on his feet, pointing an accusatory finger at Elijah. "You know what?" Jordan's words slurred together. "Dad's probably wished we were all more like you. The rest of us are just disappointments." "That's enough!" Thomas's voice cut through the chaos. He positioned himself between his sons, his face etched with concern. Everyone in the living room. Now. Once they were gathered, Thomas looked at each of his children in turn. "This family is hurting," he said softly, "and we need to talk about it." Jordan's anger crumbled suddenly, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. "I can't," his voice broke. "I can't measure up. I try to drink it away, but it just gets worse." Tears streamed down his face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Tamika, who had been silent until now, reached for Jordan's hand. "I understand," she whispered. "The fear of not being good enough. It eats you alive." "But you are good enough," Zora interjected, her voice trembling. "Both of you." Jordan wiped his eyes roughly. "I need help," he admitted, the words seeming to physically pain him. "I can't keep doing this." Thomas moved to kneel before Jordan, taking both his hands. "Then we'll get you help. All of us. Together." Thomas Blake sat at his desk late into the night, researching counselors and support groups. His reading glasses perched on his nose as he made careful notes, determined to find the right help for both Jordan and Tamika. The next morning, he presented his findings over breakfast. "I've found a counselor who specializes in helping artists rebuild their confidence," he told Tamika gently. "And Jordan, there's a support group that meets twice a week at the community center." Both children stiffened at his words. Jordan pushed his cereal bowl away, his jaw tight. "I don't need to sit around talking about my feelings with strangers." "And I'm done with art," Tamika mumbled, staring at her hands. But Thomas remained patient yet firm. "Just try one session. That's all I'm asking." After a week of gentle encouragement, Tamika agreed to meet the counselor. She returned from her first session quiet but thoughtful. Meanwhile, Jordan reluctantly attended his first support group meeting, though he sat in the back and didn't speak. As the weeks passed, something began to shift. Zora noticed Tamika's art supplies gathering dust and approached her sister one afternoon. "Would you paint me?" she asked softly. "I've always wanted to see how you see me." Tamika hesitated, her hand hovering over her covered easel. "I might not be any good anymore." "That's okay," Zora smiled. "We can find out together." With trembling hands, Tamika uncovered her easel. She picked up a brush, and though her strokes were uncertain at first, having Zora there made it easier. They spent hours together, talking and laughing as Tamika painted, rekindling not just her art but their sisterly bond. Jordan's transformation was slower but steady. In his support group, he found people who understood his struggles without judgment. He started speaking up, sharing his story in small pieces. The weight he'd been carrying began to feel lighter. When Jordan asked his family to attend one of his meetings, Thomas felt a surge of pride. They sat together in the community center as Jordan stood up to speak. "I tried to drown my feelings of inadequacy," Jordan admitted to the group, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "But my family never gave up on me, even when I was at my worst." He looked at each of them, Thomas, Tamika, Zora, and Elijah. "They showed me what real strength looks like." Thomas watched his children supporting each other, seeing how far they'd come. Tamika reached for Jordan's hand when he returned to his seat, while Zora and Elijah moved closer to their siblings, forming a tight circle of support. The first signs were subtle. Thomas Blake's occasional shortness of breath, the way he needed to rest more frequently, how his usual energetic stride had slowed. He brushed off the children's concerns with gentle smiles and reassurances. "Just getting older," he'd say with a warm chuckle, patting whoever asked on the shoulder. On a bright Sunday afternoon, the family gathered at the local botanical gardens for their monthly outing. Tamika had brought her sketchbook, inspired by the blooming spring flowers. Jordan, sober for 3 months now, was pointing out different plants to Zora and Elijah, showing off knowledge gained from his new gardening hobby. Thomas watched his children with pride, leaning against a wooden railing near a koi pond. The fish swirled beneath the surface in lazy circles, their orange and white scales catching the sunlight. He felt a familiar tightness in his chest but ignored it, not wanting to interrupt the peaceful moment. "Dad?" Zora called out, using the term that had naturally evolved over their years together. "Come look at these roses." Thomas straightened and took 2 steps toward her voice before the world tilted sideways. The tightness in his chest became a vice grip. His vision blurred, darkening at the edges. He heard Jordan shout his name, felt the impact as his knees hit the ground, and then nothing. When he regained consciousness, he was in a hospital bed, the steady beep of monitors filling the sterile air. Tamika sat beside him, her sketchbook forgotten in her lap, tears streaking her cheeks. Zora and Elijah huddled together on a small couch by the window, while Jordan paced the room, his hands shaking with barely contained anxiety. The doctor's words fell like heavy stones. Stage 4. Lung cancer. Extensive spread. Limited options. "How long?" Thomas asked quietly, conscious of his children's presence. "Without treatment, maybe 6 months. With aggressive therapy, we might extend that to a year, possibly more," the doctor replied, her voice gentle but firm. Thomas nodded, his mind already racing to practical matters, the house, the children's education, their future. But before he could speak, a familiar voice cut through the room. "Don't you dare try to handle this alone." Lena stood in the doorway, still wearing her business suit, her normally perfectly styled hair disheveled from what must have been a rushed journey. Jordan had called her the moment Thomas collapsed. "The younger ones need to know everything," Lena insisted, moving to Thomas's bedside. "We're not children anymore. We deserve the truth." "They've been through enough," Thomas protested weakly. "We're stronger together," Tamika spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "You taught us that." As the reality of their situation sank in, old tensions began to surface. Lena pulled out her tablet, already researching treatment options and specialists. "We could sell the house," she suggested. "It would cover the best medical care available." Jordan's face tightened at her words. He'd been considering the same solution, but for different reasons. Debts from his drinking days still loomed over him, threatening to come due. The guilt of his secret weighed heavily as he watched his siblings rally around their father. "We need to think this through carefully," Lena continued, her lawyer's mind already formulating plans and contingencies. "There are decisions to be made." Thomas watched his children, seeing the strain already showing on their faces. The progress they'd made, the healing they'd achieved. He feared it might all unravel under this new pressure. But before he could speak, a wave of exhaustion washed over him, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep as his children's worried voices faded into background murmurs. In Thomas's workshop, surrounded by the familiar scent of wood shavings and motor oil, Jordan searched for some old tools. As he moved aside a stack of boxes, a weathered shoebox caught his attention. Inside, hundreds of small paper slips filled the container, each one carefully dated and folded. Jordan picked up the first note, his hands trembling slightly. Thomas's neat handwriting covered the paper. "Dear Lord, please watch over Jordan. His music brings such joy, and I see the goodness in his heart fighting to break free. Help him find his way." Tears welled in Jordan's eyes as he read note after note. Some were about Lena's strength, Tamika's artistic spirit, Zora's gentle soul, and Elijah's quiet wisdom. Each prayer revealed Thomas's deepest hopes and fears for his children, spanning years of their lives together. While Jordan sat surrounded by these testaments of Thomas's love, he heard a commotion from upstairs. Tamika's voice carried down the stairs, uncharacteristically sharp. "Zora, what are you doing? That's Dad's savings." Jordan found them in Thomas's bedroom. Zora frozen by the dresser with an envelope in her hands. Tamika blocking the doorway. Tears streamed down Zora's face as she collapsed onto the bed. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't know what else to do. The debts keep growing." "What debts?" Tamika asked, sitting beside her sister. Between hiccuping breaths, Zora confessed to her online gambling addiction. It had started innocently enough, a few games during lonely nights when everyone else seemed busy. But the losses mounted, and the promises of winning it all back proved hollow. Jordan's hand instinctively went to the gold watch on his wrist, Thomas's gift for his first year of sobriety. He remembered Thomas's words. "Time is precious, son. Use it wisely." Looking at his broken sister, Jordan made his decision. "How much do you owe?" he asked quietly. When Zora named the figure, Jordan nodded. "I know someone who deals in vintage watches. This should cover it." "Jordan, no," Zora protested. "Not your watch. Dad gave you that." "And Dad taught us to take care of each other," Jordan replied firmly. "We'll tell him you're away at a work program. It'll give you time to get help." Tamika looked at her brother with new respect. "I'll help find a counselor," she offered. "Someone who specializes in gambling addiction." As Jordan carefully removed the watch, he thought of the prayer notes in the workshop. Thomas had always believed in their potential to be better people. Maybe it was time they started believing it too. In the sterile hospital room, the steady beep of monitors provided a somber backdrop as the Blake siblings gathered around Thomas's bed. Lena stood by the window, her lawyer's briefcase at her feet, while the others sat in various chairs around the room. "We need to discuss options," Lena said, her voice steady but strained. "A private care facility could give Dad the best possible treatment. If we sell the house—" "Sell our home?" Zora interrupted, wringing her hands. "But all our memories are there." Tamika nodded in agreement, her artist's sketchbook clutched tightly to her chest. "There has to be another way." The door opened and everyone turned to see Elijah entering, still wearing his marine biology research uniform. His unexpected arrival created a ripple of surprise through the room. "I caught the first flight I could," he said quietly, moving to Thomas's bedside. Thomas stirred, his eyes focusing on his gathered children. Despite his weakness, he managed a warm smile. "I need to talk to all of you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The siblings drew closer as Thomas explained his wish to purchase a large family burial plot. "To keep us together," he said, reaching for Jordan's hand. "Even after—" "Dad, we should be focusing on treatment options," Lena interjected, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "A burial plot can wait." Jordan squeezed Thomas's hand. "I understand, Dad. You want us to stay connected." Tamika's eyes filled with tears as she looked between her siblings. Zora couldn't meet anyone's gaze, the weight of her recent actions heavy on her conscience. Elijah remained quiet but nodded supportively at Thomas's words, his scientific mind understanding the profound symbolism of their father's request. After the others had left to get coffee, Thomas beckoned Jordan closer. From beneath his pillow, he withdrew a sealed envelope, its edges slightly worn. "Jordan," Thomas whispered, pressing the letter into his son's hands. "When I'm gone, share this with your siblings. And please, make sure about the burial plot. Promise me you'll keep the family together." Jordan's fingers closed around the envelope, his throat tight with emotion. "I promise, Dad. I won't let you down." "I know you won't, son," Thomas replied, managing a small smile. "You've come so far. I'm proud of you." In the dimly lit living room of the Blake family home, Lena paced back and forth, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her face was flushed with anger as she turned to Jordan, who sat on the worn leather couch. "How could you list our home without telling anyone?" she demanded, thrusting the phone screen towards him. "I found the listing online. Were you planning to sell it behind our backs?" Jordan ran his hands through his hair, exhausted. If you'd checked the date, you'd see I took that down weeks ago. After Dad told us about the burial plot, I realized what really mattered. And I'm supposed to believe that? Lena scoffed. Tamika stepped between them, her artist's hands raised in a peaceful gesture. Please, both of you. Dad needs us united right now, not fighting over something that isn't even happening anymore. The tension in the room thickened as Zora stood up from her corner chair, tears streaming down her face. I need to tell you all something, she said, her voice trembling. I've been gambling. Online. I stole money from Dad's savings to cover my debts. The confession landed like a bomb in the room. Lena staggered backward, her face pale with shock. You did what? That's why Jordan sold his gold watch, Zora continued, her words tumbling out. He was helping me cover the debt so Dad wouldn't find out. Lena turned away, her shoulders rigid. More secrets. Is anyone in this family honest anymore? I'll help. Elijah's quiet voice cut through the tension. He'd been standing in the doorway, observing the scene. I have savings from my research work. We can use it to pay off Zora's debts and contribute to Dad's care. The siblings stared at him, surprised by his offer. Tamika wiped tears from her eyes, moved by the gesture. Lena's expression softened as she looked around at her siblings, Jordan's protective stance near Zora, Tamika's pleading eyes, Elijah's steady gaze, and Zora's tearful remorse. She took a deep breath. Okay, she said finally. We'll keep the house, and we'll honor Dad's wish for the burial plot, but no more secrets between us. We need to stand together now. The others nodded in agreement, the tension in the room finally beginning to dissipate as they found their way back to each other. The aroma of home-cooked meals filled the Blake family kitchen as the siblings bustled about, preparing for their family dinner. Tamika carefully arranged her homemade lasagna on the counter, while Jordan set up mismatched plates on the dining table, the same ones they'd eaten from as children. Remember when Dad tried to teach us all to cook? Zora asked, placing a bowl of salad next to Tamika's lasagna. And Jordan nearly burned down the kitchen trying to make toast? Jordan laughed, adjusting the silverware. Hey, that toaster was defective. Besides, I wasn't the one who put metal in the microwave. That was Elijah, Lena corrected, bringing in her signature apple pie. He was trying to conduct an experiment. Elijah, arranging glasses on the table, smiled sheepishly. In my defense, I was 8, and Dad turned it into a teaching moment about scientific method. As they gathered around the table, the familiar creaks of the old chairs brought comfort. The warm glow of the overhead light cast a gentle ambiance over their meal, reminiscent of countless family dinners shared in this very spot. This lasagna tastes just like Dad's recipe, Jordan said, taking a generous bite. How did you get it so perfect, Tamika? He taught me the secret ingredient, Tamika replied, her eyes twinkling. Extra oregano and patience. The conversation flowed naturally, peppered with laughter and shared memories. They recalled the time Thomas had organized a backyard camping trip, complete with ghost stories and slightly burned marshmallows. Each story brought them closer, healing old wounds with remembered joy. During a comfortable lull in conversation, Tamika set down her fork and cleared her throat. I've been thinking about Dad's wish for the burial plot, she began carefully. What if we created a family fund? We could all contribute what we can. The siblings exchanged glances across the table. Lena, who had been quietly eating her salad, straightened in her chair. I think that's a wonderful idea, she said, surprising everyone. In fact, I'd like to match whatever we collectively contribute. It's the least I can do after everything Dad's given us. Jordan's eyes widened. Are you serious, Lena? Absolutely, she replied firmly. We're family. It's time I started acting like it. Zora reached across the table and squeezed Lena's hand. Thank you, she whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. Elijah pulled out his phone and started creating a shared document. We can track everything here, he explained. Keep it transparent and organized. The next day, they visited Thomas at the hospital, finding him propped up in bed, looking tired but happy to see them. His face lit up when all 5 of his children entered the room together. "Well, this is a wonderful surprise," he said, his voice weak but warm. They pulled chairs close to his bed, forming a tight circle. Thomas looked at each of their faces, his eyes full of love. "You know," he began, adjusting his position slightly, "I never told you about how I decided to adopt all of you." The siblings leaned in closer as Thomas shared the story of losing his wife and son in a car accident years before. He spoke about his depression, his return to teaching, and how working with children helped him heal. "When I saw all 5 of you at the adoption center," he continued, "something just clicked. I knew you belonged together, and I wanted to be part of that." The siblings listened intently, gaining new understanding of the man who had chosen to be their father. Each story he shared revealed another layer of his life before them: his childhood dreams, his marriage, his grief, and ultimately, his decision to create a new family with them. Next day, the old drawer creaked as Lena pulled it open, sending a small cloud of dust into the air. She and her siblings were sorting through Thomas's belongings at home, trying to organize important documents and memories while he remained in the hospital. "Look at this," Lena said, lifting out a worn leather photo album. The corners were frayed, and the spine was cracked from years of handling. The siblings gathered around as she opened it carefully. The first page revealed a much younger Thomas, his hair dark and full, standing next to a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "I've never seen her before," Tamika whispered, touching the photograph gently. Jordan pointed to another photo showing the same woman holding a small boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old. The child had Thomas's eyes and was grinning widely at the camera, missing his front teeth. "There's writing on the back," Elijah noticed, carefully removing the photo. "Margaret and Michael, Summer Picnic 1995. Zora looked confused. "Dad never mentioned having another family." They brought the album to the hospital that afternoon. Thomas's eyes filled with tears when he saw it resting in Lena's hands. "I wondered where that had gone," he said softly, reaching for it with trembling fingers. "Who are they, Dad?" Jordan asked gently. Thomas took a deep breath. "Margaret was my wife," he explained, his voice thick with emotion. "And Michael was our son. We lost them in a car accident 20 years ago." The siblings listened intently as Thomas shared his story. He spoke about meeting Margaret in college, their wedding, and the joy of raising Michael. His voice cracked as he described the rainy night when a drunk driver changed everything. "I was lost for a long time after that," Thomas admitted. "Teaching was the only thing that kept me going, but something was still missing." He looked at each of his children with profound love. "When I saw all of you at the adoption center, I recognized that same loneliness in your eyes. I thought maybe we could heal together." Tamika wiped tears from her cheeks. "Is that why you took all of us? Because you didn't want us separated?" Thomas nodded. "You needed each other just like I needed you. I wasn't trying to replace what I'd lost. I was hoping to build something new, something different, but just as precious." Jordan reached for Thomas's hand, squeezing it gently. The siblings exchanged glances, understanding dawning in their eyes. Their father's capacity for love hadn't diminished with his loss. It had grown, making room for all of them in his heart. "Thank you for choosing us," Lena said softly, her usual composure cracking. "For making us a family." Thomas smiled through his tears, holding the photo album close to his chest. "You children gave me back my life," he whispered. "You gave me a reason to hope again." The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors. Dr. Stevens spoke softly to the gathered siblings, her expression grave. "Your father's condition has deteriorated significantly. I'm afraid he doesn't have much time left, maybe a few days at most." The news hit them like a physical blow. Lena immediately organized a schedule, ensuring someone would be with Thomas at all times. They brought in comfortable chairs and took shifts, watching over their father as he drifted in and out of consciousness. During his more lucid moments, each sibling spent precious time alone with Thomas. Elijah's turn came on a quiet afternoon. He sat beside the bed, holding his father's frail hand, his scientific composure crumbling. I'm sorry I wasn't around more. Elijah's voice cracked. I got so caught up in my research, the marine biology projects. I should have visited more often. Thomas squeezed his hand weakly. No, son. You followed your dreams. That's exactly what I wanted for you. His voice was barely above a whisper, but his eyes were clear and focused. Watching you succeed, seeing your passion for science grow, it made me so proud. Later that evening, Zora sat with Thomas, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Dad, I messed up so badly with the gambling. I stole from you when you needed the money for treatment. Thomas lifted his hand to brush away her tears. Zora, my sweet girl, he murmured. We all make mistakes. What matters is that you're trying to make things right. My love for you has never wavered. As night fell, Thomas asked for all his children to gather around his bed. Despite his weakness, he spoke with clarity and purpose. Listen to me, all of you, he said, his gaze moving from face to face. I didn't give you a home for my sake, I gave it for yours. Promise me you'll always take care of each other. They nodded through their tears, hands clasped together around his bed. Hours passed, and the siblings took turns resting, but Jordan refused to leave. Something in Thomas's expression told him to stay close. Near midnight, Thomas stirred. Jordan, he called softly. Jordan leaned in close to hear his father's words. You've grown into such a strong man, Thomas whispered. I'm so proud of how far you've come. Take care of them for me, son. You have such a big heart. Use it to keep this family together. Jordan gripped his father's hand tightly, tears falling freely. I will, Dad. I promise. Thomas's eyes grew heavy, but a peaceful smile played across his lips. He squeezed Jordan's hand one last time before slipping into unconsciousness. Jordan watched his father's breathing become shallow, each breath a precious moment slipping away. The other siblings gathered close, drawn by the change in their father's condition. They stood together, united in their grief and love, watching over the man who had given them everything. Each of them remembered the day he had knelt before them in the adoption center, promising they would never be alone again. Now they faced the reality of keeping that promise for each other. The morning after Thomas's passing, the siblings gathered in their childhood home. The familiar living room, filled with memories of happier times, now felt eerily quiet. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air, while family photos on the walls seemed to watch over them. Jordan cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. Dad gave me something before. His voice cracked as he pulled out the sealed envelope from his jacket pocket. He wanted us to read it together. The siblings settled onto the worn couch and chairs, forming a circle. Lena sat straight-backed, her lawyer's composure barely masking her grief. Tamika huddled close to Zora, while Elijah perched on the armrest, his eyes red from crying. With trembling hands, Jordan opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. Thomas's familiar handwriting filled several pages. My dearest children, Jordan began reading aloud, his voice thick with emotion. The letter spoke to each of them individually. To Lena, Thomas praised her strength and dedication to the family, while gently reminding her that vulnerability wasn't weakness. For Jordan, he expressed pride in his journey of recovery and growth. Tamika's artistic spirit drew special mention, with Thomas encouraging her to never doubt her talent again. He acknowledged Zora's struggles and assured her of his forgiveness, emphasizing her capacity for change. To Elijah, he wrote of his admiration for his scientific mind and caring heart. Remember, Jordan read, that family isn't just about blood or legal documents. It's about the love we choose to give each other every day. You may have started as 5 separate children, but you've grown into something beautiful together. Tears flowed freely as Jordan reached the final paragraphs. Thomas revealed that he had already arranged and paid for the family burial plot, wanting to ensure they would always have a place together. Even in death, he wrote, I want you to know that I've tried to take care of you. The siblings sat in stunned silence, processing their father's final gift. Finally, Lena spoke up, her voice unusually soft. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I canceled the house sale weeks ago. I couldn't bear the thought of losing our home, all these memories." "Really?" Zora looked up, hope flickering across her tear-stained face. "Yes," Lena nodded. "Dad made this place more than just a house. It's where we became a family." "Then let's keep it that way," Jordan suggested, carefully folding the letter. "For Dad, for us, and for whoever comes after." The siblings looked around at the walls that had witnessed their transformation from scared, distrustful children into a real family. Through Thomas's words, they found renewed purpose in their unity, determined to honor the legacy of the man who had given them so much more than just a home. In the living room of the Blake family home, sunlight filtered through the curtains as the siblings gathered around the dining table, now covered with papers and funeral planning materials. The weight of their loss hung heavy in the air, but there was also a quiet determination in their faces. Lena spread out a notebook, her legal training showing in her organized approach. "We need to make this service special," she said, her voice steady despite her red-rimmed eyes. "Dad deserves something personal from each of us." Tamika, who had been sketching absently on a notepad, looked up. "I'd like to create a mural," she offered softly. "Something that shows our journey with Dad, from the day he adopted us to—" She trailed off, but her siblings nodded in understanding. "I've been working on a song," Jordan admitted, fiddling with a guitar pick in his pocket. "It's not finished yet, but I think I can have it ready. Dad always loved when I played music." Zora, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "What if we plant a tree at his burial site?" Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Something that will grow and live on, just like his love for us." "That's perfect, Zora," Elijah said, squeezing her hand. He cleared his throat. "I'll write the eulogy. I want to share stories about Dad, help people understand what he meant to us." The siblings looked at each other, a moment of shared understanding passing between them. Then Lena remembered something. "The location," she said. "We need somewhere meaningful." "The park," Jordan suggested immediately. "Remember how Dad used to take us there every weekend? He'd push us on the swings, read stories under that big oak tree." "And he taught us about different birds and plants," Elijah added, a small smile crossing his face. Tamika nodded enthusiastically. "It's perfect. Dad loved nature, and that park holds so many memories." "The gazebo could shelter people if it rains," Zora pointed out practically, "and there's plenty of space for everyone." As they discussed the details, marking down tasks and assignments, a sense of unity settled over them. They weren't just planning a funeral. They were creating a farewell worthy of the man who had given them everything. "Dad would have loved this," Tamika said softly, looking at their plans. "All of us working together like this." The others murmured in agreement, and for the first time since Thomas's passing, the room felt lighter. They had found purpose in their grief, a way to channel their love into something meaningful. The park was transformed on the morning of Thomas Blake's funeral. Gentle sunlight filtered through the oak trees, casting dappled shadows on the gathered crowd. Former students, neighbors, and friends filled the rows of chairs, their presence a testament to the lives Thomas had touched. Tamika's mural stood proudly behind the podium, a masterpiece of color and emotion. The painting captured pivotal moments. Thomas teaching in his classroom, reading bedtime stories to his children, and tending to his beloved garden. Each brushstroke seemed to pulse with love and memory. As the ceremony began, Elijah approached the podium. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his notes, but his voice rang clear and strong. "Our father taught us that family isn't just about blood," he began. "It's about choice, about love that perseveres through the hardest times." He shared stories of Thomas's patience, his quiet wisdom, and the way he could make each child feel special and understood. Jordan took his place next, guitar in hand. The opening chords of his song floated across the gathering, his voice raw with emotion as he sang about second chances and unconditional love. Tears flowed freely among the audience, and even Lena, who had maintained her composure throughout the morning, wiped her eyes. Zora stepped forward, her poem clutched in slightly shaking hands. Her voice, usually timid, grew stronger with each verse as she painted pictures with words of Thomas's gentle spirit, his encouraging smile, and the safe harbor he had created for 5 lost children. The ceremony reached its pinnacle as the siblings gathered around the spot chosen for the memorial tree. Each took turns placing soil around the young oak's roots. Lena went first, her movements precise and deliberate. Jordan followed, his hand lingering on the trunk for a moment. Tamika added her portion with an artist's grace, while Zora sprinkled her soil gently. Elijah completed the circle, patting the earth firmly into place. The crowd joined together in a hymn, their voices rising and falling like waves. As the last notes faded, a peaceful silence settled over the park. The breeze rustled through the leaves above, nature's own tribute to Thomas Blake's memory. In the quiet weeks that followed Thomas Blake's funeral, the family home felt different. The absence of his humming in the kitchen and his footsteps in the hallway left a hollow echo that none of the siblings could ignore. They found themselves gravitating toward the living room each evening, seeking comfort in each other's presence. One such evening, as they sat surrounded by photo albums and memories, Lena straightened up suddenly. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice breaking through the contemplative silence. "About Dad's legacy. What if we could continue his work?" The others looked up, curious. Lena's eyes brightened as she continued, "What if we turned our home into a community center? A place where people could learn and grow just like Dad always encouraged us to do?" The suggestion sparked immediate interest. Tamika sat forward, her artist's mind already racing with possibilities. "We could have art workshops," she said, gesturing to the walls where her paintings hung. "Help others find their voice through creativity like Dad did for me." Jordan nodded enthusiastically. "And music classes," he added. "The garage could be converted into a practice space. Dad always said music heals the soul." "We could offer counseling services," Zora suggested quietly, thinking of her own struggles. "Help people who are facing difficulties, just like Dad helped us." Elijah, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "I could develop educational programs about marine biology, make science accessible to everyone. Dad always believed in making learning fun." They spent hours drafting plans, their excitement growing with each idea. Lena's legal expertise helped structure the proposal, while Tamika sketched potential layouts for the spaces. Jordan calculated renovation costs. Zora researched similar community programs, and Elijah developed curriculum outlines. The following week, they arranged a meeting with community leaders at the local council hall. The siblings presented their vision for Blake's Haven, taking turns explaining different aspects of the project. Lena handled the legal framework, while the others detailed their specific program proposals. The community leaders listened intently, nodding with increasing enthusiasm. When the presentation concluded, the council chairperson spoke warmly about Thomas's impact on the community and praised the siblings' initiative to continue his work. Other leaders offered support, promises of funding, volunteer coordination, and resource sharing. As the meeting concluded with handshakes and excited discussions, the siblings exchanged glances of quiet triumph. In their shared purpose, they had found a way to keep their father's spirit alive, transforming their childhood home into a beacon of hope for others, just as it had been for them. The transformation of the Blake family home began on a bright Monday morning. Lena arrived first, armed with paint samples and renovation plans. Soon, Jordan pulled up in his truck loaded with tools, while Tamika brought easels and art supplies. Zora and Elijah came bearing cleaning supplies and furniture donated by community members. As they began working, neighbors started showing up with food, tools, and helping hands. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door brought her famous enchiladas, while Mr. Chen, Thomas's former colleague, arrived with his entire family ready to help paint. The house buzzed with activity as rooms were cleared, walls were stripped, and new possibilities emerged. "Remember when Dad caught us sliding down these stairs in laundry baskets?" Jordan laughed as he pulled up old carpet. Tamika smiled, wiping sweat from her forehead as she painted the living room walls a warm yellow. "He didn't even get mad, just joined in and showed us how to do it safely." Zora worked on organizing the future counseling space, her eyes misting as she recalled quiet conversations with Thomas in that very room. Elijah set up educational displays in what was once their father's study, carefully incorporating Thomas's old teaching materials. While clearing out the attic, Lena discovered a weathered box tucked behind some old Christmas decorations. Inside, she found several leather-bound journals, each marked with different years. Her hands trembled as she recognized Thomas's neat handwriting. "Everyone come here," she called out. The siblings gathered around as she opened the first journal. "Today I watched Lena argue her point during dinner," she read aloud, her voice catching. "She'll make an incredible lawyer someday, fighting for what's right. I pray she'll use that passion to help others." Each journal entry revealed Thomas's deep observations and hopes for his children. He'd written about Jordan's musical talent, Tamika's artistic gift, Zora's gentle spirit, and Elijah's scientific mind. But what struck them most were his final entries, where he'd written about his dream of seeing them work together to impact their community. "I see them all grown," Lena read, tears falling onto the pages, "each with their unique gifts. Perhaps someday they'll join these gifts together, creating something beautiful for others. That would be my greatest joy." The siblings sat in silence, surrounded by paint cans and renovation tools, as the weight of their father's words settled over them. They looked around at the half-finished rooms, seeing them now through Thomas's eyes, not just as spaces for programs, but as vessels for his legacy of love and service. The work continued with renewed purpose. Each nail hammered, each wall painted, each room arranged became an act of honoring their father's vision. As Blake's Haven took shape, the siblings felt Thomas's presence in every corner, guiding them toward his dream of unity and community service. The morning of Blake's Haven's grand opening dawned bright and clear. The siblings arrived early, each attending to final details. Lena straightened the welcome banner while Jordan tested the sound system one last time. Tamika arranged her art supplies meticulously, setting up easels in what was once their family dining room. Zora organized chairs in a circle for her support group space, and Elijah checked the marine biology displays he'd created in Thomas's old study. The center looked transformed. Photographs of Thomas lined the hallways, snapshots of him teaching, playing with the children, and working in his garden. Tamika's mural dominated the main wall, depicting their family's journey from 5 scared orphans to the united adults they'd become. "Did we remember to put out enough refreshments?" Lena asked, checking her clipboard for the 10th time. Jordan squeezed her shoulder reassuringly. "Everything's perfect, sis," he said. "Dad would love this." As the doors opened, families began streaming in. Children's laughter echoed through the rooms, bringing new life to the old house. In the art room, Tamika helped young artists create their first paintings, her gentle guidance reminiscent of Thomas's patient teaching style. Jordan's music room pulsed with energy as he taught kids basic chord progressions, their faces lighting up when they produced their first clear notes. Zora led her first support group session, her voice steady and compassionate as she shared her own story of overcoming challenges. In the science room, Elijah captivated children with interactive displays about marine life, his enthusiasm infectious as he explained ocean conservation. Lena moved through the center, ensuring everything ran smoothly. She paused occasionally to watch her siblings in their element, noting how naturally they'd stepped into roles that honored their father's legacy of education and community service. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, the last visitors departed with smiles and thanks. The siblings gathered on the front porch, exhausted but fulfilled. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky paint itself in shades of orange and pink. "I felt Dad with us today," Tamika said softly, leaning against the porch railing. "In every room," Zora agreed, her eyes misty. "Remember how scared we were that first night he brought us here?" Jordan asked, looking at the front door where they'd first entered as uncertain children. "And now look at us," Elijah added, gesturing to the center behind them. Lena watched her siblings, noting how far they'd come from their broken beginnings. Through all their struggles, Jordan's addiction, Zora's gambling, Tamika's self-doubt, and their collective grief, they'd emerged stronger, more united. Thomas's dream of his children working together had become reality, though not in any way they could have predicted. The autumn breeze rustled through Blake's Haven as a new face appeared at its doors. Michael, a lanky teenager with downcast eyes and hunched shoulders, stood hesitantly at the entrance. His social worker had recommended the center, hoping it might help the troubled 15-year-old find direction. Lena noticed him first, recognizing the familiar look of uncertainty she'd seen in her own siblings years ago. "Welcome to Blake's Haven," she said warmly, keeping her distance to avoid overwhelming him. Over the next few weeks, Michael became a regular presence at the center. Jordan found him lingering near the music room, fingers tracing the guitar strings when he thought no one was watching. "Want to learn?" Jordan asked one day, and Michael's slight nod marked the beginning of their connection. In Tamika's art space, she discovered Michael's interest in photography after catching him studying the family photos on the walls. She brought in an old camera, showing him how to capture moments that spoke to his heart. His first genuine smile appeared when she praised his unique perspective in a photograph of the center's oak tree. Zora recognized the pain behind his silence, having carried similar burdens. During group sessions, she created space for him to listen without pressure, understanding that healing began with feeling safe. Gradually, Michael started participating, his voice growing stronger with each shared story. Elijah's marine biology presentations caught Michael's attention unexpectedly. The teen's eyes would light up during discussions about ocean conservation, and he began staying after sessions to ask questions. Elijah saw his own childhood curiosity reflected in Michael's growing enthusiasm. As spring approached, bringing the anniversary of Thomas's passing, the community gathered around the oak tree they'd planted in his memory. Michael stood with the siblings, no longer the uncertain boy who'd first entered their doors. He held his camera, documenting the moment as community members shared stories about Thomas's impact. Lanterns glowed softly in the twilight, waiting to be released. Each sibling held one, and Michael stood between Jordan and Tamika, holding his own. As they released the lights into the darkening sky, tears flowed freely but peacefully. The siblings watched the lanterns rise, carrying their love for Thomas upward, while Michael captured the moment through his lens. In that gentle evening light, surrounded by the community Thomas had loved, the siblings felt their father's presence in the way Michael now stood tall among them, a living testament to the power of acceptance and unconditional love that Thomas had taught them so well. If you enjoyed the story of Thomas Blake and the 5 siblings, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.